All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to go over some basic variables and basic variable types in JavaScript to get a sense for how do we work with variables, right? How do we get started with JavaScript? So JavaScript variables are going to get declared similar to the way they do in Java or in R or in Python. The main difference here is that JavaScript variables are dynamically typed. So that means that when we declare a variable, we don't also declare the type. Variables will take on or have whatever type that's the type of their value. So values have types, right? We have the same kinds of strings and numbers and stuff that we're normally used to. It's just that the variable isn't associated with that type. Variables can have any type we want. So in JavaScript, we declare new variables by using a keyword called generally let. That's one of our options. We'll go some others in a second. So we don't just declare, we declare a keyword, use the keyword let to say I'm making a new function, a new variable. I'm saying let this variable, this value, right? This variable represents some value. So we might say like let x be equal to hello. That then creates a new variable hello, a new variable x whose value is hello. That now declares it. Hello is a string, right? Because it's string in quotes. So therefore, x is a string variable. If later in the next line of code, we want to say x and have it become a different variable, like 42, we can instead assign a 42 to x. And now x is of type 42, a number. It's a different kind of value. So the variables are dynamically typed. They change in value, but the values themselves do have a type, and that type does matter and is consistent. And that kind of gives us our variables. So it's worth noting that we can declare variables without assigning a value to them. This is kind of similar to what you can do in Java. So for example, I could make a variable called hours slept, and I could just not define it, right? I can say that's the end of my code. There's no equal symbol. I haven't assigned a value to it. If you don't assign a value to a variable, then it does in fact have a value. It gets a default value. And if we console log, we can see what it is. So I'm going to create a variable hour slept. I'm going to console log it. It's actually probably going to give me an error. Nope. When I console log it, right, the one coming from line 9 is the value undefined. So undefined is a special value in JavaScript. It's similar to null in Java, though JavaScript also has a null, which is also similar to null in Java. It's kind of similar to none in Python. It's kind of similar to NA or the other options in R. It's kind of a special value, right? It's not the string UNDIFINED, right? It's not the undefined string. It's a special value undefined. And it's one of my favorite parts of the JavaScript language because it means exactly what it says. It's used for values that are undefined, that have not been defined yet. So if I say, what is hour slept? Hour slept is undefined. I don't know what it is. It doesn't exist yet. So it's worth noting that that's the way that that's a value that will pop up and we'll see actually quite a lot in our JavaScript work. Stylistically, JavaScript values are camel cased. We don't write them in snake case like we do in Python. We write them out using camel casing. And that's just, again, the sort of standard style for writing JavaScript variables. Okay. So I said that let was one of the ways of declaring variables. Any variable you declare with let can be reassigned later. So for example, if I declare a variable let x is equal to hello, and then I can reassign x to be 42, even demonstrate to you that this works, right? If I can console log x, right? X is 42, it has changed, everything's gone fine. Alternatively, we can declare a variable using the keyword const. So instead of saying let x be equal to hello, we would say const x be equal to hello. Instead of saying let hour slept, we would say const hour slept. So it's going to be an error. Leave that let for a moment. The difference between let and const is that a value that is declared as const cannot be reassigned later. So if I assign with an equal symbol a value to x, I cannot assign a different value to x later. We've declared x as constant, as not being able to be redeclared. If I then try to redeclare it, I'm going to get an error. I'll get a type error saying that I cannot assign to a constant variable. Similarly, if I try to, for example, make a constant variable like hour slept, and if I call this out for a second. If I try to make this an hour slept thing, you'll notice it's giving me a red squiggle underline, something has a problem. It's because you have to assign a value to a const variable because you can't ever reassign to it later because that const variables cannot be reassigned. Yeah, so that's how that works. In practice, right, so that's const. Const is similar to the final keyword in Java. I don't know if there's an equivalent in Python doing the same work. In practice, we use const 98% of the time. Almost all the time, we want variables to be const. What you'll find when programming in JavaScript, and really programming in actually a lot of different languages, a lot of different systems, is that you don't actually reassign variables very often. It's really rare to want to have a variable and then change that value in the future. More commonly, you're going to take a variable and then create a new variable that is some variation of that, right? It's been modified in some way. So you've got the old version and the new version. Or you're going to make a variable and then pass it into a function, and then the function is going to do some work and then return a new value. So it's very rare that we actually want to change a value to be something else. It does happen occasionally, but it actually is not very common. So what tends to be better practice is to use const or final in Java or other syntaxes in other languages. What that'll do is it avoids the bugs that happen from you accidentally reassigning a variable. It keeps you from having something that you thought was some value and then having accidentally changing it because you assigned a variable, because you reused a variable that you weren't expecting to. You use a single equals instead of a double equals when you're trying to do a comparison. There's lots of ways you can sort of accidentally in your code assign different values to variables, and it makes this very insidious bugs. They're very hard to track down. So if we use const instead, then we don't have that problem nearly as often, and you'll find that you actually don't end up having any issues declaring a bunch of constant variables. So what I recommend doing is declaring all variables as const. Whenever you make a new variable in JavaScript, const is the way that we're going to do things. If you then find that you do in fact need and want to reassign that specific variable for a valid reason, then you just go back into your code and you change the const to a let. And that's fine, right? We're able to edit code later, like after you write some code, you can always go back and change the earlier parts of it. So I would declare this as const. And then when I realize I'm trying to reassign X to be hello, I realize that's a problem. I really wanted some number to be 42. And then I don't have my problem anymore. This tells me, oh, look, I actually forgot to assign my hour slept. My hour slept is going to be 0. I haven't slept today, we'll say. And like, again, it's helping me catch these bugs and catch these errors as I'm going. Great. JavaScript does also support a way of declaring variables using a keyword var. That's the older way of declaring variables. We don't use that. We haven't used it for almost a decade now. Don't use var in declaring variables at all in this class. If you're using var, it looks like you are not involved in this course. You're trying to write JavaScript code from 10 years ago. We don't use var. We only use const and let. Mostly const, occasionally let. Right, use const wherever you can. Okay. In terms of variable types, JavaScript supports the same basic variable types that most other languages do. JavaScript has numbers. There's no differences between integers and floats. We don't have int and double, int and float. We just have numbers. From JavaScript's perspective, everything is a number, whether that's a number with a decimal or a number without a decimal. It does also mean that, for example, that JavaScript has sensible math, right? If I take 4 and divide by 3, I get 1.3 as I would expect, right? We don't have integer division in JavaScript the way we might have in Java. So yeah, we can declare variables as numbers. There's fine. We can declare variables as strings by using quotes. JavaScript doesn't distinguish between single quotes and double quotes. They're both used for strings. This is the same as it is in Python, the same as it is in R, different from Java, where strings are single or double quotes are different between strings and characters. In JavaScript, they're all strings. They're all fine. So doesn't matter what you use. The real rule is just be consistent, just so that it's easier to read. My personal practice is that I use double quotes for any strings that the user will eventually see, anything that's like a full sentence that I want to be able to display, stuff like hello world. And I use single quotes for anything that's more of like an internal value that's not going to be relevant to the user, or that I'm using as just staying my own, like I'm saving my own data, I'm labeling something, or I'm doing some other kind of work. That's not super consistent. It doesn't happen all the time. I break that rule, but that's kind of my general heuristic if you need some rule. Otherwise, pick your favorite, go with it, and just be consistent. You're fine. Okay. JavaScript has Booleans. There are just like they are in Java or Python or R. Unlike in JavaScript, the Booleans are written as lowercase true and lowercase false, as opposed to Python, where it's which is capital true, capital false. We don't have the shortcuts that we get in R, T, and F. It's just lowercase true, lowercase false. But again, these Booleans work the same way as other Booleans you've encountered. Finally, I'll note that if you're curious and you want to sort of see what's going on with something, there is an operator in JavaScript called type of, And you can use that to say type of in front of some value or in front of some variable to say what type of thing is this, right? What type is that value? So for example, if I wanted to say what is the type of X, I can say what is type of X, and it tells me that X is a string, right? This returns a string representation of the data type of that value. This can be useful for debugging. Don't use this for actual any logic in your code because data types is not like actually what you should be doing to represent data. Data type is a metadata piece of information about that, but it can be really useful for debugging. Is this thing a string? Was it a number? Was it a Boolean? Was it an array? Like what kind of data structure was I using? This will sort of be able to help you find that information. All right, cool. Basic Java, basic data types. The other thing about JavaScript and data types is that JavaScript will let you combine and operate across multiple data types in kind of confusing ways. JavaScript does what's called coercing data types in order to try to make them work together. JavaScript really wants to be friendly, and so it tries really hard to do that. So as an example, let's go to our code here. So I'm going to comment this stuff out for a moment. So if I had a, we're going to console log this out. So let's see what it looks like. Console log. So if I took the, what's my example here? Sorry. So if I took the number 40 and I tried to add 2 to it, I'm sorry, I'm taking the string 40. This is a string, it's in quotes, and I tried to add the number 2 to it. What JavaScript will end up doing is it says it takes the 40, that's a string. This is a string, that's a number. Those are 2 different types. It takes the 40, it says that these are different types, so it takes the 2, converts it into a string, and then concatenates them together, right? It adds them together, combines them into one piece. This is the same behavior you're probably used to seeing from Java. You don't see this in Python. Python is more restrictive about data types, but the same kind of behavior you're used to seeing in Java. Similarly, if I then take my 40 and I subtract 2, then you would kind of expect the same thing, right? It would take 40 as a string. It would try to then take 2 as a string, subtract them, and you can't actually subtract strings because strings subtraction doesn't exist. What JavaScript then does instead is it says, oh, well, I can't subtract strings, but if I take that 40 and I convert it into a number, then I can subtract it instead. So what JavaScript will do is it'll actually try to coerce, it'll try to cast and convert these data types on either side of the operand in any way it's going to make the logic work in a more sensible way. Right, that gives me then 38. It's not even just a first or second thing, right? Because again, if I try to take the number 40 and I add the string 2 to it, I still get the 42 because again, JavaScript says it's easier to convert from things from numbers into strings than it is from strings into numbers. To be clear, I can't subtract a string. Like if I took 40 and I tried to subtract 4, it still gives me the 36. I'm not even allowed to subtract strings, right? That's an illegal. Actually, if I try to subtract strings, it says you can't subtract strings, and it converts them both into numbers. The reason you can't subtract strings is because if I was actually trying to take 404 and subtract 4, then the question is which 4 am I removing? So that can't be done. Computers can't do it, so you're not allowed to subtract strings. So again, JavaScript will coerce data types. It'll convert even 2 string operators. It'll convert them both into numbers in order to make that operator, that subtraction, meaningful and valid and make that work. This is called type coercion. It's actually one of the biggest challenges with JavaScript. And they can get worse. They can actually get a little bit more confusing. So let's take 2 variables. We're going to take a number 10 and then a string 10, right? The string that's the 2 characters 10 that looks like a 10, but it's not the number 10. It's a string whose value happens to involve the characters that are the same ones we use to represent the number 10. But it's a string. These are 2 values, which means we can compare them, right? We could compare them for things like an if statement or for any kind of logical operation. If we compare them using a Boolean operator, like double equals, for example, which is similar to R or Java, we can basically get a Boolean back to say, are these 2 things the same thing? So for example, if I want to say, let's define a result, which I want to say is number the same as string, right? Because that's going to be saying, well, here, we'll call it, are the same. Are same, I guess, are same. So if I want to say, is it true that number and string are equal to each other, right? So this is going to be a Boolean, are same yes, are same no. If I then console.log that, right here, let me put some space. That should make the thing pop a little better. If I say, is the number 10 and the string 10, are they the same? JavaScript says, yes, they are the same. That is a true statement. Because from JavaScript's perspective, these two things can be coerced into one another. I can take this number 10 and I can add quotes around it. I can coerce it into being a string, at which point now it is exactly the same as the number 10. That can be, of course, an issue, right? If I'm actually trying to compare values, one's a number, one's a string, they seem like they should be disparate types, but JavaScript will compare them as the same. In JavaScript instead, then, what we can use is we can use an additional operator, which is a triple equal symbol. The triple equal symbol says, are these two values the same, both in terms of can they be compared and cast into the same type, and do they in fact have the same type to begin with, right? Are they the same without any kind of coercion, without any kind of casting? And if we do that, we can then see that these numbers are not the same, right? The number 10 and the string 10 are different things from each other. To be clear, the reason these things can be casted together is because they have the same characters in them, right? If I tried to say, is the number 10 the same as the word 10, right? Even without the quotes, right? Even starting without trying to enforce using strict equalities, that still tells me false because I can't take this, and if I put quotes around it, it's still a different thing than TEN. Right? JavaScript doesn't actually know that numbers like have word representations. It's literally just saying like, can I convert these symbols into other symbols? Okay, so the triple equals operator will let us be able to compare values, making sure that while they retain the same type without any kind of coercion. It tends to be best practice. If ever you're going to be using equals to compare anything, you should be using triple equals. There is an equivalent not double equals, which is sort of the triple, the saying not the same thing in terms of, well, again, ignoring without allowing any coercion. All right, the one other place that then gets really kind of silly, right, is if I, again, go back to just using my double equals, I say, are these things effectively the same? If I try to compare two really weird values, like say an empty string, so a string with no content inside of it, and then the value 0, and I say, are those two things the same? JavaScript, an empty string that has no characters versus a 0 that's sort of this single symbol, are those two things the same? When we log it out, it says yes, they are in fact both the same. The reason they are both the same is because both of these can be coerced into the value false. So empty string, 0, false are all considered sort of coercible equivalent values. These are what are called falsy values. What that often means then is that you can actually be writing an if statement or something like that. You can actually have an if statement that says if empty string, and that's considered a false value. Undefined is also considered a falsy value. Null is a falsy value. There's lots of these values are sort of the kind of the no answer, and they all can get coerced into one another. Okay. String coercion is not a thing that's going to necessarily pop up a lot. And if we're very careful about how we work with our variables, that won't become an issue for us at all. If you use triple equals, you'll probably never have any problems. It's worth noting that because data typing is so undefined, right? Because it's not built into the code itself, we often have to track that all ourselves. So a really good way of doing that is that when you're naming variables is to also include the data type in that variable name. So for example, when I said that this was hour slept, it might be better to say hour slept num, right? I'm toward indicating that this variable is a number, not hour slept Boolean. Were there hour slept or not hour slept string, hour slept number. Similarly, if you imagine that you could have, this could be my 10 that's a number. This could be my 10 that's a string, right? If I name my if I name my values, Boolean, if I name my variables with their data type, it often becomes easier as I'm reading and writing my code to be able to track what kind of data I'm working with so that I don't end up having weird coercion errors, or so I don't actually get any problems where I'm sort of comparing or working with values that I'm not expecting. Java will enforce that with type checking and compile time. But in JavaScript, same way you might do in Python, naming those variables carefully so that you can keep track of what kind of thing you're working with will help you a lot as you're writing more complex applications. Okay, that's the basic ideas of JavaScript data type. Those are the most basic data types. In the next video, we'll go through some more complex data structures that will also get used a lot in JavaScript.